In today's edition, we want to take a critical look at the committee's role in the petroleum revenue management space and understand what it can or cannot do within the remits of the law. Stay with us for another educative session on this subject. Remember, you can send in your questions and comments as the discussion progresses, and we'll respond to them. I am your host, Jessica A. Champon. Joining me today is a PIAC member, Mr. Constantine K.M. Kujaji, who will be sharing some insights on this topic. He's a member of PIAC representing the Christian groups and is also well-versed in petroleum law. So, Mr. Constantine K.M. Kujaji, this is your first time on Time with PIAC, so a special welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. It is a pleasure being here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here to talk about use of petroleum revenue and its management. So, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so we get the discussion ongoing, but for someone who's just joining us in this session for the very first time, can you tell us a bit more about PIAC and the processes that led to its establishment?
Thank you very much, Jessica. PIAC simply is the acronym for Public Interest and Accountability Committee. Now, this is a statutory committee made up of some groups established for purposes of seeing to the prudent management and use of petroleum revenue from the upstream petroleum industry. I say upstream because in the petroleum sector, we have the upstream, we have the midstream, and we have the downstream. PIAC's mandate has to do with the revenue from upstream and midstream. That is the production of crude oil and natural gas, transportation to the refinery and processing. As to what happens at the downstream, where we have the supply of processed petroleum and gas, that is not under the mandate of PIAC. So we seek to monitor the use of revenue from these operations, what we call petroleum operations, within the context of the Act establishing the Public Interest and Accountability Committee. Now, to your second question as to what led to the establishment of PIAC, there is this notion, but of course it's a reality, that petroleum can lead to, especially revenue from upstream petroleum industry, can lead to prosperity. And we have evidence throughout the world that if these revenues are used prudently, it transcends into economic development of the country. Now, we've been mining gold and other minerals such as diamond, bauxite, for over 100 years. We had not seen the impact of these resources felt by the citizenry. And we were blessed to discover oil in commercial quantities in 2007. Even though hitherto we've had discoveries during the colonial era and in Sopon somewhere in the 1970s. But these were not of commercial quantities as we had in 2007. So with that, the idea came that, look, we need to guard against the misuse of the revenue from this resource. And therefore, there was this national call that we shouldn't let what has happened in the mining industry happen again. So there was a call for a national dialogue and discussion as to what we should do with petroleum revenue. And therefore, this committee was established, of course, under the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which sought to regulate how revenue from petroleum operations should be utilized. So this committee was established under Section 51 of the Act to monitor the use of the revenue by the various stakeholders, because you have stakeholders like the Ghana Revenue Authority, which is the collector of the revenue. You have the Bank of Ghana, which is our government purse. That is where the monies are paid. You have the Ministry of Energy, Petroleum Commission. You have GNPC, which is the National Oil Company. So there was the need to ensure that the monies that are paid to these institutions or are paid by these institutions are monitored in terms of its use and management and investment to ensure that the citizens benefit, to ensure that it leads to maximum economic development. Now, if you look at Article 2576 of our 1992 Constitution, it is clear that, look, petroleum resources, or minerals for that matter, belong to the people of Ghana and are held in trust by the President of the Republic for and on behalf of the people of Ghana. So the resource belongs to us as citizens, and we have to benefit. So if somebody is in a position of trust, the essence of trust is that I give you something to manage for my benefit. So we've entrusted the resources to the President to manage on our behalf. And it is important that it is managed in accordance with our wishes and to our benefits as a nation, in line with, of course, Article 36 of the Constitution. So if that is the case, you should have a citizen-led body to ensure that the aims and aspirations of the citizenry are met in terms of the usage of this, the revenue from this resource. So that is the whole essence of the establishment of PIAC. And if you look at its composition, it cuts across the citizenry in terms of the composition. So that's the whole essence of for the establishment of PIAC.
Okay, so we realized that the committee was established primarily because of oil and gas production, but nothing about your name suggests or relates to oil and gas or petroleum revenue management. Has that affected how the public perceives you?
To a large extent, yes, because sometimes when you even mention what is PIAC, people don't really know what we do. People think it's one of those, for want of a better word, think tanks and all that. They don't see it really in terms of petroleum production, oil and gas production, or for that matter, its revenue. So I agree with you that the name seems to be too broad. Public Interest and Accountability Committee. What exactly is the public interest about? What exactly is the accountability about? So some people have even suggested that it should be Petroleum Revenue Management Committee, so that we are clear that straightforward, this is the mandate of PIAC. But that's another debate altogether. But then when you go to the Act itself, it spells out the mandate of PIAC, and even though the name is Public Interest and Accountability Committee, our main mandate is to deal with the use and utilization and management of petroleum revenue, as I said, from the upstream oil and gas industry, and to a large extent also the midstream. So yes, I agree with you that the name doesn't have a clue as to oil and gas, or a link as to oil and gas or petroleum. But if you want to know why we were established or why PIAC was established, then you have to go to the source document, which is the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, precisely Section 51. Yes.
Okay, so now we'll go to the source document, which is the Petroleum Revenue Management Act. Was it very explicit on the mandate of PIAC?
Yes, it was. As I said, it was, because if you look at Section 51, it is threefold. The mandate, Section 51 establishes the committee, and then Section 52 deals with the mandate. Now, the first mandate, as I pointed out earlier, is to monitor and evaluate. So we just don't monitor. We have to evaluate. When you say somebody should evaluate, you understand? You have to analyze. So we have to monitor, look at, and evaluate the use and management of the revenue in compliance with the provisions of the Act. So the Act gives various functions to various stakeholders. Like I said, the Bank of Ghana, the Ghana Revenue Authority, and other stakeholders as to what they should do with regards to petroleum revenue. So it is the mandate of PIAC to ensure that what the Act tells these stakeholders to do, they do, in terms of the management and use of petroleum revenue. The second mandate is to have a space and platform for debates. As a nation, we have our vision. We have our directive principles of state policy, under which we have our political, cultural, economic, and social objectives. The question is, if we want to develop, how do we develop with this revenue? Now, the Act itself under Section 21(3) deals with what we call priority areas where revenue from petroleum should be channeled. So PIAC's mandate is to have a space and platform for debate and discussion, whether the revenue is being used in line with that provision. So you talk of agric, you talk of industry, you talk of health, you talk of support for people with disability, and so many. You can talk about 10 priority areas. Now, if the money is spent on buying A4 sheets in government organizations, the question is that a prudent use of the revenue? So it is for the public to debate on this based on the report that PIAC comes up with to see whether it's in line with Section 21. And if it's not in line with Section 21, then 21(3), then what do we do? So that's the second mandate of PIAC. Then the third is we have to do an assessment on the use. And we do the assessment to help Parliament and the executive, who more or less are responsible for the disbursement of these revenues. Okay, for instance, there is a portion of petroleum revenue which should go into what we call ABFA, annual budget funding amount, to support the national budget. The budget is approved by Parliament. So we have to do an assessment and submit to Parliament whether or not the chunk that should go to the ABFA is being used to support developmental projects as outlined in the budget. Again, the executive itself, which prepares the budget for approval, needs to know, by way of an assessment, whether, for instance, the previous ABFA complied with the provisions of the Act. Okay, so these are the mandates, as I said, 3 mandates of PIAC, as spelled out in the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, precisely Section 51. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes. Indeed, you have. And if you are just joining us, this is Time with PIAC. And today we are looking at the role of the committee within the petroleum revenue management space. And my guest is Mr. Constantine K.M. Kujaji. He's a lawyer, so you can understand how he's quoting the provisions and taking his time to explain the issue so that we can really understand the role of the committee. He just gave us a brief background to PIAC and then its mandate as stated in the law. But Mr. Kujaji, at this time, we'd want to delve more into petroleum revenue management. Are there specific provisions or systems that the law puts in place to guide how we get to use our petroleum revenues?
Yeah, there are systems. Now, the first thing the Act did was to establish the Ghana Petroleum Fund, what we call the Petroleum Holding Fund, which is the PHF. Now, within the Act, we have what constitutes petroleum revenue. So you are talking of royalties that accrue to the government. You are talking of rentals for blocks. You know, when we say blocks, the petroleum field is demarcated into, if I should say, like plots of land. But it's offshore. So whatever block you take is like taking a piece of land, and then you pay rent. So the rentals from these blocks constitute petroleum revenue. And then we talk of corporate income tax from the oil and gas companies and even GMPC. And then you talk of additional oil entitlements and other revenues that come from the participation, either direct or indirect participation from petroleum operations. There is also what we call capital gains, okay? When you sell a petroleum asset, let's say you bought the asset for $1 million. You use it for some time, you sell it for $2 million. You would have made a gain of $1 million as against the purchase price. And that is revenue to you. If you rent petroleum equipment and you get money, it's revenue to you. So all these revenues should go into the Petroleum Holding Fund. Again, export of petroleum. If you export crude oil, what you pay, or what is paid to you or what is received by you is petroleum revenue. So all these money should go to the Petroleum Holding Fund, which is the PHF. And this was a fund established to be handled or managed by the Bank of Ghana. So it is from these funds then that there are various disbursements to various stakeholders as to the use of the petroleum fund. Now, apart from that, there was the creation of the Ghana Stabilization Fund, GSF. The idea was that if you reap the revenue, the benefits, and there is a time that you don't get the anticipated revenue, stabilization comes from the word stability. You should be able to balance. You shouldn't swing because you are poor. Now you are not getting the revenue. So there is a need for that stabilization. So if the revenue is not coming as expected, then you can fall on that stabilization fund to be afloat so that you don't sink as a nation. So a percentage of the Petroleum Holding Fund should go into that stabilization fund. Then there was also the establishment of the Ghana Heritage Fund. This is a fund for the future. Oil and gas is a non-renewable natural resource. You can exploit it today, from today, after 50 years, it's off. You can't get it again. Tomorrow, if we are not exploiting oil and gas, or petroleum for that matter, and we are not getting the money, what happens to our future generation? We would have squandered the money without they benefiting. So the Heritage Fund was to cater for the future generation. So a percentage of the revenue from petroleum should also go to the Heritage Fund to support our children, our children's children, our children's children's children, the future generation, who would have died and gone. But then what happens to the future people, especially when there is, especially when at that point there will be no production of petroleum. Now, when you put this together, we call it the Ghana Petroleum Wealth Fund. Okay, the Stabilization Fund, and then the Heritage Fund. Then we have the ABFA, Annual Budget Funding Amount. Now, we have what we call the benchmark revenue, okay, the anticipated revenue from petroleum in any financial year. The Act provided that 70%, or not more than 70% of the amount should be paid to the annual budget funding amount to support the national budget for development projects, for economic development. It's not to be paid there for anything. Projects that we call priority areas, infrastructure, and also for long-term development plans, okay? So 70% should go into that. And then 25% of the petroleum revenue, or what is paid annually into the PHF, should also go to infrastructure development, okay? So these are some specific provisions. And then the Bank of Ghana was required, or is required, to make proper accounts, keep proper accounts of these funds and their expenditure. The same responsibility is put on the GRA and other stakeholders. And as PIAC, we have to always report on these, monitor, get information from them, and report whether they are complying with these provisions in the Act, whether the monies are being paid into the PHF, what do we get every year, and etc., etc., etc. So these are some of the specific provisions in the Act, and these are some of the things that were put in place when we discovered petroleum.
Okay, thank you very much for that elaborate thoughts on this particular question. So we realize that the law is very clear on what each institution is supposed to do, what each fund is supposed to do, and all of that. So how does PIAC really fit into that space when it comes to petroleum revenue management?
Yes, PIAC fits into it by virtue of our mandate. I mean, we are to ensure that these provisions are carried through. And that's the whole job of PIAC. So what we do is that we monitor, we receive information, and we are mandated to publish a report. As I speak, I think PIAC has published about 11 annual reports, and or 12. Yes, 12 annual reports, and 17 semi-annual reports, or 16. Yes, so basically we have all the information in these reports to guide the relevant stakeholders. And we fit in the sense that if there is a lacuna, our report will bring it out for them to improve on it. We make recommendations. The only problem as we have as PIAC is that sometimes the recommendations are delayed in terms of their implementation. Yes, that's for me is the only challenge. But we fit in well. We do our job as a committee as mandated by the Act.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kujaji. So like I said, this is Time with PIAC. And if you have any questions at this point, you can just drop it in the comment section and we will respond to them before we wrap up. But Mr. Kujaji, we realize that there's a lot of misconception when it comes to the work of PIAC with regards to the use of the oil money. I'm sure through the outreaches, sometimes you hear people telling you that, can't you use the oil money to come and do this for us? Can't you use the oil money to come and do that for us? But clearly we know that you do not have control over how the money is even disbursed and how projects are selected and all of that. So how are you correcting this misconception that people have about PIAC?
Yes, it's unfortunate that people have these misconceptions. As you rightly pointed out, we don't have control over how these monies are disbursed. Of course, we have to ensure that they are disbursed and used in accordance with the provisions of the Act. Now, whilst we monitor, we evaluate, we assess, and we open up the debate, the challenge, however, is that sometimes we don't have that compelling authority or power to say that use it for this. If you don't use it, you will be sanctioned, etc., etc. In fact, the Act makes it an offense for anybody to do something which is not in compliance with the Act, or where the person has to do something he doesn't do, it makes it an offense. But the question is, who is to prosecute that person? It is not PIAC. We don't have that prosecutorial power to prosecute. And therefore, it is the state agencies like the Attorney General and other institutions such as IOCO, and even Parliament itself, which should take up this mandate. Within the context of the Act, PIAC cannot do anything in terms of enforcement of its recommendations. We can only recommend. But as to whether the recommendation has been carried through to the latter, it's a matter of concern for some of us, because as I said, some of them, the implementation delays. And if we don't have that political will to ensure that the recommendations of PIAC are implemented, we have that bite to ensure that, look, if you don't do this, this is what will happen. I think the misconception of people will change. Okay, I mean, people feel that, or people think that, look, we don't see anything about this petroleum revenue, and you keep talking about PIAC. What do PIAC do? Mm-hmm. But of course, if you are not within the committee, you wouldn't know. If you read our reports, especially now we have the citizens version, you will see what PIAC is doing. And I believe that is what we are mandated to do. Of course, currently there is a decline in production of oil, okay? For the past 4 years, there has been a constant decline, on the average 9.2%. Now, in 2019, production peaked to about 71 million barrels. In that year, now, last year we recorded 48 0.4 million barrels. So there is a decline. Now, we have recommended that steps should be taken. There is the need for reinjection and reinvestment in the upstream petroleum sector. But it is not PIAC to implement, it is not for PIAC to implement that. It is for the government to implement that. Whether the government, and that is our assessment rule. Okay, we've now shown the report. The report is out there. We've assessed and seen the situation. So that we have performed our mandate under the Act. So it is for the powers that be to say that, look, what are we doing about this decline? What is the problem? Let's solve it. This is it. So, so far as it's unfortunate, people will have misconceptions, but I believe we are on course. Yes.
Indeed, PIAC is on course, and we will keep doing what our mandate tells us to do. But before we wrap up this conversation, Mr. Kudaji, we realize that, for want of a better word, the committee is a bit handicapped when it comes to the implementation of its recommendations. So we see repeated recommendations, PIAC is reiterating, PIAC is calling on, PIAC is urging on. If we continue on this path, what really will be the future of PIAC when it comes to petroleum revenue management?
Yeah, definitely. I think the answer is in your question. If we continue like that, then it will mean that PIAC will be a toothless bulldog. But then it wouldn't happen like that. I believe we can find a way. And sometimes we advocate that if the recommendations are out there, there are so many civil society groups who can take up some of these issues for purposes of enforcement by our courts, etc., etc. For instance, there was a case which was taken to the Supreme Court in respect of some spending, yes. And the Supreme Court came out with a clear-cut decision on that. Now, the future of PIAC is bright, so long as we continue to produce petroleum from the upstream sector and we receive revenue. Yes. The future of PIAC is bleak if steps are not taken to ensure that we continue to produce, because if you don't produce, where will be the revenue that you are going to manage? There will be nothing for us to manage. And at that point, then the relevance of PIAC will be, will not be felt. Now, in terms of our future being bright, you see, again, irrespective of any challenge, some of the recommendations have been implemented. And for me, that means all is not lost. Okay, all is not lost. Now, recently, due to agitation by PIAC and some members, the government gave a directive that certain shareholding of a certain company be paid into. You get me? This is how it works. It was because of pressure from PIAC and other institutions. So, in terms of the future of PIAC, I think it's bright, but again, we have to have the political will as a nation to ensure that we take the necessary steps to improve our upstream petroleum sector.
Okay, thank you very much. But I have a question here from Frimpoma Hansen, and she says that my question to lawyer is, do you think PIAC should be given prosecutorial powers?
I'll say yes and no. I say no because I think we have enough institutions to ensure that the relevant stakeholders comply with the act. Now we have the Office of the Special Prosecutor. The issue should not be about prosecuting people who are found to be corrupt, etc. No. So the Office of the Special Prosecutor can be given special powers to, as it were, deal with such issues with regards to the role of PIAC. We have the Office of the Attorney General, under which we have the Criminal Prosecution Division. We have IOCO. We have some state agencies. So giving PIAC the prosecutorial power should be a last resort. But if those institutions cannot do what they have to do, because it's clear that when you don't do something or you do something wrong within the act, it's an offense. Yes. So if nothing works, then PIAC should have that power to compel the institutions or the stakeholders, to, as it were, implement the recommendations of PIAC as we give them out. And again, civil society groups can also do that, yes. I sit in here, I can get up and go to the Supreme Court for some interpretation or some order to compel a state agency to do what it should do within the limits or within the context of the law. But I am a member of PIAC, and there is that issue of conflict of interest. Okay, yes, if I were not a member of PIAC, I'm a citizen of Ghana, I could do that. So, within the context of PIAC, it will be a bit awkward for us to do that. But if the need arises, and we have a special body under PIAC to do that, that's fine. Yes.
Okay, that will be
I
all
hope I've
for
answered
Frimpoma's question.
Yes, sorry,
Yes.
Frimpoma's question.
Okay, but if you have other questions as well and you come to watch this video later, you can just drop it in the comment section and then we will respond to you. So thank you very much, Mr. Constantine K.M. Kujaji, a member of PIAC representing the Christian groups, for making time to give us some legal education on Time with PIAC this afternoon. We look forward to hosting you another time.
And thank you very much, Jessica. It's a pleasure, and I hope the education has been beneficial to our listeners and our viewers.
Indeed, it has been, and we get that feedback in our comment section. So thank you all for making time to join us in this very educative session. I believe that you now have a broader perspective on what PIAC really does within the petroleum revenue management space. Let us continue with the discussion. If you have any questions or comments, you can just reach us via any of our communication channels and we'll respond to you. You can also send us a WhatsApp on 055-441-6544 and we'll respond to any questions or comments you would. A champion. Until we come your way next month with another educative session, let's keep the conversation going. Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon.